Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you everyone for coming out today. I live in a neighboring state, but had no idea that there was such a beautiful campus next door in Kansas. I had a chance to talk to some of your colleagues, and it struck me that this is a very serious university in terms of the development of the study of non-Western societies, the Arab and Islamic world included. And I'm hoping I can make a contribution today to the intellectual sort of atmosphere here at your university. And what I want to do is I want to give and develop and talk about a few key interpretive themes that have repeatedly hindered an objective assessment about the relationship between Islam and democracy in the West. And while many of these themes have a very long history in the Western interpretation of Muslim-majority societies, these issues have resurfaced again recently after the start of the Arab Spring. And this afternoon I want to provide an alternative set of analysis and arguments and ideas that are far more optimistic about the future prospects for democracy in the Middle East and the broader Islamic world than is generally appreciated and taken into consideration in popular and intellectual forums here in the United States. And specifically, I want to provide a critical analytical framework where I hope you can understand and think about this emotionally charged topic about the relationship between Islam and democracy in new ways. And I want to do so historically, comparatively, and dispassionately. So while the 2011 Arab Spring has been widely celebrated in the West, the popularity and rise of religious-based Islamist parties, with sometimes their frequent references to Sharia or Islamic law, and the ongoing violence in the Arab world, the Benghazi attack, the situation in Syria, instability in Egypt and Tunisia, have cast a shadow of doubt about the future prospects for democracy in the Middle East. And a recent Pew Research poll revealed that nearly 60% of Americans do not believe that recent changes in the Middle East will lead to a lasting improvement for the people of the region. And also, in this same poll, a majority of Americans, about 54%, believe that it is more important to have stability in the Arab world, even if this comes with less democracy. And in this context, I'm reminded of this famous statement by a former American UN ambassador and foreign policy advisor to the Republican Party, the late Jean Kirkpatrick, who was asked about 20 years ago what she thought about the relationship between Islam and democracy. And she thought about the question, she paused for a moment, and then she famously said, quote, "The Arab world is the only part of the world where I've been shaken in my conviction that if you let the people decide, they will make fundamentally rational decisions," end quote. I think that's a sentiment that has deep roots and widespread support in large segments of the United States. The election results in Tunisia and Egypt, where secular parties and liberal parties did poorly. Islamist parties, the Muslim Brotherhood, did quite well. I think speaks to this point. In 2006, you had the most freest and democratic elections in the Arab world in the case of the Palestinian occupied territories, and lo and behold, Hamas wins. About a decade earlier, you had elections in Algeria. The Islamic Salvation Party wins. What's going on? What are Western liberals, what are Americans supposed to think? Now, I'm of the view there has been a lot more to the post-9/11 and post-Arab Spring debate here in the United States about the relationship between Islam and democracy than simply a concern about the scarcity of democratic political systems in the Middle East. The scholarly literature on the preconditions for democracy is remarkably advanced. Although predicting when a country might undergo a democratic transition is not an exact science, social scientists have identified a key set of variables that make the possibility of a transition more likely. These are usually identified with certain levels of socioeconomic modernization, industrialization, literacy, mass communications, etc., class structure, the existence of a sizable middle class, and a suitable political culture, where cultural norms, habits, and values that are democracy enhancing are in place. The more these variables are in play, the greater the prospects for democracy. In the post-9/11 debate on Islam and democracy here in the United States, however, these issues have rarely been explored in the mainstream. Instead, the mass media and intellectual arguments on this topic have come to represent a set of concerns rooted in cultural and civilizational difference. The question, is Islam compatible with democracy, by itself has become an all-encompassing catchphrase that encompasses a widespread frustration and condemnation with the general state of underdevelopment in the Muslim world. Specifically, commentators, pundits, and intellectuals have asked, why is there so much anger, so much instability, so much social conservatism in Muslim-majority societies today? Why the prevalence and popularity of religious fundamentalism, the unrelenting calls for violence, and the deplorable state of human rights, women's rights in particular? Now that this violence emanating from the Islamic world has come into the heart of American cities and is perceived to be directly affecting the quality of life of millions of Americans and Europeans, a level of anxiety about these questions have risen to new heights. In short, the post-September 11th media and intellectual debate in the West about Islam and democracy has often boiled down to this. Why is the Islamic world seemingly so different from societies in North America and in Europe? Why are they not more like us? And this basic point of departure, of assuming and expecting cultural and civilizational similarity, has formed the essential and enduring backdrop to an inquiry about the relationship between Islam, Muslims, and democracy. And from the outset, this debate has been framed in ways that are prone to analytical distortion. The essential problem with the question, why are they, Muslims, not more like us, Americans, is twofold. First, the question mistakenly assumes that the West has always been democratic, has always been peaceful, and has always been liberal, and that you can draw a straight line from ancient Athens to 21st century North America without any detours along the way. No serious historian would entertain such an argument. As Mark Mazur has written in his very important book, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, it is incorrect to think of Europe as the natural home of human rights and democracy. The last 100 years of European history clearly suggests that the continent was often a terrifying laboratory for social and political engineering, inventing and reinventing itself through war, revolution, and ideological competition. Fascism and communism, Professor Mazur argues, should be regarded not as exceptions to the general rule of democracy, but as an alternative forms of government that attracted millions of Europeans by offering different solutions to the challenges of the modern world. By 1940, the prospects for democracy looked bleak, and Europe's future seemed to lie in Hitler's hands. These, I think, are sobering reminders that should inform any serious inquiry about the study of international affairs today, particularly in relation to the study of non-Western societies, their histories, and their problems with political development. Secondly, to expect Muslim societies to mirror the West in terms of social norms is to ignore the fact that the historical experience of these societies has been qualitatively different in many ways from the Western experience, both in the pre-modern era and in the modern period. To assume that Muslim societies have undergone the exact same political, economic, social, and intellectual transformations as the West is to project and impose Western history onto the Islamic world. This problem is deeply embedded in the broader question of the nature and causes of underdevelopment. What explains the chasm between the northern tier countries and those of the global south? How does one account for the huge differences, not only in terms of wealth and economic growth, but also in terms of good governance and constitutional rule? Why did modern representative government first emerge in the West in Protestant majority societies and then spread to the rest of the world? There are no simple answers to these questions, nor there is time here to properly explore them. Various theories and explanations have been offered over the years, and there's little consensus on which factors are the most salient in explaining these outcomes. The broader interpretive point here is that where one begins to investigate a social question, and the assumptions that are brought into the initial inquiry can often predetermine the outcome. Assessing the relationship between Islam and democracy demands a sense of history. Unless one can recall the long and very torturous history of democracy in the West, its ups and downs, and long turbulent trajectory, understanding the topic in other cultural or regional settings can lead to misrepresentation. comparison is indispensable in avoiding the trap of cultural essentialism and religious exceptionalism. Islam is not the first religious tradition to struggle with the relationship between religion and politics, nor will it be the last. It should be remembered that the origins of political philosophy here in the West are rooted in the tension between religion and democracy. Socrates, you may recall, was brought to trial and sentenced to death by democratic Athens for corrupting the minds of the young and for the charge of religious impiety. Furthermore, prior to the development of political secularism in the West, church and state were often deeply intertwined. At the social level and the societal level, religion played an influential role in the political life of Europe right up into the 20th century, where Christian democratic parties were frequently elected. And today, here in the United States, religion continues to play an important role in American democracy. And as the debate over Barack Obama's Muslim heritage versus his Christian faith reminds us, one cannot get elected President of the USA today unless the candidate is openly and explicitly Christian, and sometimes that isn't even enough. Furthermore, in a seminal work on religious systems and democracy, Columbia University democratic theorist Alfred Stepan has reminded us that all emerging democracies face political conflict and struggle over the normative role of religion in politics. No democracy is immune from this dispute, and any objective reading of history will reveal that for many long-standing democracies in the West, a major source of conflict for a protracted period of time was precisely the tension between religion and politics. In his essay, Stepan explores various maps of misreading in the history of religion-state relations in Europe. He is critical of an ahistorical approach to the topic, which often suggests that the consolidation of democracy requires a hostile and rigid separation between religion and state. A closer reading of the topic, Stepan suggests, will reveal that virtually no Western European democracy now has a rigid or hostile separation of church and state. Instead, most Western countries have arrived at a democratically negotiated freedom of religion from state interference, and they all allow religious groups freedom not only of private worship, but to organize themselves in civil society. It is in this constant political construction and reconstruction of what he calls the twin tolerations between the institutions of the state and the religious institutions in civil society that both groups learn to respect certain minimum boundaries of freedom of action, that an understanding of the relationship between religion and democracy should be properly rooted. In thinking about the relationship between Islam and democracy today, the case of Catholicism and democracy is deeply instructive. Just as it is said today with regards to Islam, until the 1960s, Catholicism was widely viewed as being deeply and enduringly anti-democratic and illiberal. The Enlightenment critique of religion was based on the tenets and behavior of the Catholic Church. For centuries, the Vatican opposed modernization, it opposed secularization, it opposed liberalism, democracy, socialism, capitalism, feminism, and the sexual revolution. This view was so pervasive that a distinguished American political scientist, Seymour Martin Lipset, in a widely cited and influential article in 1959 on the prerequisites for democracy, could observe, without any controversy or debate, that, quote, the linkage between democratic instability and Catholicism may also be accounted for by certain elements inherent in Catholicism itself. The relationship between Catholicism and modernity gradually changed, however. The major catalyst for this were the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in 1962, which addressed an updated Catholic doctrine in the modern world. Soon afterward, there was a major expansion of democracy known as the third wave of democratization. And according to Samuel Huntington, this spread of democracy was overwhelmingly a Catholic wave, in that roughly 3/4 of the countries that transited to democracy between 1974 and 1989 were predominantly Catholic majority societies. Jose Casanova, another leading scholar of the topic, specifically credits the reforms of the Vatican II Council for allowing Catholicism, for the first time in its history, to openly support democracy and human rights, which contributed significantly to this third wave of democratization. In thinking about the relationship between Islam and democracy, the long and torturous conflict between Catholicism and modernity is a sobering reminder that Muslims are not sui generis. They are not unique here when it comes to this topic. And an examination of other world religious systems, such as Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Confucianism, would also, I think, be very instructive in this context. Now, in 2007, the distinguished and reputable Gallup polling firm published the most comprehensive survey of global Muslim opinion. Based on 6 years of polling in 35 countries that represented more than 90% of the world's Muslim population, it found widespread compatibility of values between Western and Muslim societies in terms of support for human rights, basic freedoms, democracy, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, even gender equality. Where the Islamic world and the Western worlds differed, however, was in their attitudes to the relationship between religion and politics. Muslims polled in this survey did not believe that greater democracy and self-determination required a Western-like separation of church and state. Quote, poll data from the large majorities of respondents in these countries surveyed cite the equal importance of Islam and democracy as essential to the quality of their lives and the future progress of the Muslim world. How can this difference between the West and the Islamic world on the question of religion and politics be explained? Again, we turn to history. The history of religion-state relations and the role of religion in public life have been qualitatively different in Muslim societies compared with the West, both in the pre-modern era and in the modern period. Different political lessons have been learned on both sides of the Islam-West divide. Part of the problem here is one of historical comparison and historical perception. Any comparative treatment of the role of religion in politics often suffers from what I call the problem of transference. This is the natural and erroneous tendency to assume that the historical experience of the West is a universal experience. Specifically, it is the misassumption that because of the West, after centuries of conflict, bloodshed, and experimentation, from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, because the West has developed, after this long period of time, a broad democratic and secular consensus on the normative role of religion in government, which has been democratically negotiated. There's an assumption that the same process has also taken place across the world. This fallacy has distorted our understanding of the politics of the Arab-Islamic world, primarily because the history and legacy of religion-state relations in this part of the world has been qualitatively different. Looking back on the Arab-Islamic world, one notices an absence. I know this is going to be a shock to many students here, but looking back on Islamic history, one notices an absence of major wars of religion comparable to the European experience of the 16th and 17th century. Nor have there been intense battles over religious toleration that have forcibly generated, like they did in Europe, new moral, political, and intellectual arguments on the relationship between religion and political authority. Most historians are in agreement that in the classical and pre-modern period eras of Muslim societies, that these societies were more tolerant of religious pluralism than societies in the West. Not in an ideal sense, nor certainly not by a 21st century liberal democratic standard, but in comparison to Christendom during the same period of time. Secondly, the classic constitution of the historic Islamic State was one where religion often served a role in terms of limiting political tyranny, rather than acting as a deep source of conflict and division. As the Harvard scholar Noah Feldman has written in his book, The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, through their near monopoly on legal affairs, in a state where God's law was accepted as paramount, the religious scholars built themselves into a powerful and effective check on the ruler. These religious scholars sometimes were able to restrain the autocratic ambitions of the sultans and the caliphs by forcing them to recognize certain limits demarcated by Islamic law in exchange for conferring political legitimacy on their rule. Religion-state relations in the Muslim world has bequeathed different historical lessons to people in the contemporary period. Today, religion in the Muslim world is viewed by significant segments of the population not as a natural ally of despotism and a source of deep social conflict, but as a possible agent of stability, predictability, and a constraint on political power. This partly explains why demands for the greater role of religion in politics does have a sympathetic hearing in parts of the Arab Islamic world today, though notably not where political Islamists are already in power. Furthermore, many Arab societies have been deeply shaped by the negative experiences of post-colonial authoritarianism. The forms of secularism associated with these post-colonial regimes have critically impacted the perceptions of Arabs and Muslims on the relationship between religion and government. These various modernization projects promoted by these post-colonial regimes that emerged after World War II were often justified in the name of various forms of secular Arab nationalism. And by the late 20th century, many of these post-colonial regimes in the Arab world were as politically repressive as they were economically corrupt. Ben Ali's Tunisia, Mubarak's Egypt, Salah's Yemen, Gaddafi's Libya embodied this state of affairs. In Syria, for example, the ruling regime today justifies its rule in part in the name of secularism. And it has responded to pro-democracy protests during the Arab Spring with such extreme brutality that both Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Human Rights Council have characterized the Syrian regime's behavior as a crime against humanity. Thus, for a generation of Arabs, dictatorship, repression, and nepotism have embodied a strikingly negative secular reality. And as a result, the turn to Islam as an alternative source of political inspiration and hope was both logical and natural. And as a consequence, at the moment, reliable polling suggests that most Arabs oppose the idea that democracy demands a Western-style form of secularism, and large majorities support the idea that Islamic law should be a source, but not necessarily the source of legislation. Now, you're all familiar with the Arab Spring of 2011. These are uprisings for democracy, for dignity, rooted in a deep-seated hunger and desire for political empowerment on a mass level, generated and promoted largely by this new youth bulge, people very much the same age as most of the people in this room, desiring a hunger for a better future, and a future that they feel can only be guaranteed by the development of democratic rule. Now, while these uprisings, as I said at the beginning of the talk, have been widely celebrated around the world in their initial occurrences, they have also led to considerable anxiety and foreboding. And it's reasonable to wonder where the Arab Spring is headed. Is it a 1989 Berlin Wall moment, or is it a 1979 Islamic Republic of Iran moment? There are serious questions that need to be asked. Now, much of the concern about the future trajectory of the Arab Spring revolutions has been focused on the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and to a lesser extent on its equivalent organization in Tunisia and Nahdin. In Civilization, the West and the Rest, the famous British-American historian Neil Ferguson has argued that the core values of Western civilization are deeply threatened by this brand of Islam espoused by the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, whom he believes are really Islamofascists that seek the restoration of the caliphate. But questions remain. What role have these groups played in the uprising? Where are they leading their societies? How much genuine support do they really have? And what are the implications of their rise to power, both for their own societies, for the region, and for the world? These are all, I think, legitimate questions that need to be asked and debated. But much of the debate in the West about the rise of these Islamist-based parties have ignored some basic sociological, historical, and ethical questions about the political development in the Arab world that I want to briefly scrutinize. Now, a central trope in the critique of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, runs as follows. This is a deeply illiberal organization whose commitment to pluralist democracy is as shaky as its commitment to women's rights and minority rights. The centrality of Sharia in its political platform is often cited as evidence. More recently, one can point to the 2007 political platform of the Muslim Brotherhood that called for an Iranian-style religious advisory council to review legislation for its conformity with Islamic law. In the same vein, this platform, which has since been revised, called for the banning of Copts and women from holding high office, particularly the presidency. Now, while there's much to be concerned with here with respect to the future role of Islamist parties in the Arab world, It can be argued that for many in the West, it is not the commitment to liberal values that is of chief concern with respect to these groups, but rather it is the commitment of these religious groups to Western foreign policy goals that really matters. In other words, mainstream Islamist parties are viewed with deep suspicion not because of their distance from Western liberal values, but because they challenge long-standing Western geopolitical interests in the Middle East, primarily related to Israel and to many pro-Western regimes in the Arabian Gulf. It is plausible that, hypothetically speaking, if tomorrow the Muslim Brotherhood were to announce its full recognition of the State of Israel, accept the legitimacy of the ruling regimes of the Persian Gulf, and devote itself to missionary work and social welfare work instead of parliamentary politics, the fear and foreboding surrounding this organization would likely drop precipitously in some Western foreign policy and intellectual circles. In an insightful essay on this topic written about 15 years ago, called Palace Fundamentalism and Liberal Democracy, the Moroccan sociologist Fatima Mernissi provided an intriguing analytical framework for considering this topic. Mernissi noted that there is a long and sordid history of Western liberal democracies supporting and promoting backward and fanatical forms of Islamic fundamentalism. This takes place because doing so advances Western geostrategic and business interests related to oil production and arms sales in the Middle East. While Mernissi's analysis was focused on Saudi Arabia and Wahhabi Islam, her argument can also be extended to many pro-Western Persian Gulf regimes, whose record on democracy and liberal values is arguably far worse than that of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. The Western response, or lack thereof, to the crackdown on pro-democracy protests in Bahrain in 2011 and up until today is an illustration of her thesis. Support for long-standing dictators and the ordinance of the Sharia are perfectly acceptable in this context. The point here is that from the West's perspective, there are good and bad forms of Islamic fundamentalism. Those fundamentalist groups and liberal regimes that line up and enhance Western geostrategic goals can be tolerated, supported, and sustained. The Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s is an example. Pakistan's Zia al-Haq is another example. They all fit this profile. But those Islamic fundamentalist regimes and movements that are politically independent and that operate outside of a U.S. foreign policy framework are to be opposed and sometimes demonized. In this moral and political calculus, liberal democratic values are of little relevance. The second point here concerns the nexus between authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, Western support that bolsters them, and the political ramifications for the future of democracy in the Arab Islamic world. Stated simply, Western support for authoritarian regimes in the Arab Islamic world has had tremendous negative political consequences for the region's prospects for democracy. Decades of political repression, particularly of secular civil society, has forced political opposition in the Middle East in the direction of the more traditional sectors of society, such as the mosque. The forces of religion have indirectly and inadvertently benefited from the authoritarian policies of the post-colonial Arab state, in part because all rival secular political organizations have been suffocated or crushed. The 2011 electoral results in Egypt and Tunisia, where Islamist parties emerged victorious, defeating very easily their secular and liberal rivals, confirms this point. Similarly, it's also instructive to briefly examine the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The rise of political Islam in Iran in the wake of the 1979 revolution made perfect sociological and political sense. The social conditions in the decades before the revolution were a specific and direct byproduct of the authoritarian modernizing policies of the US-backed Pahlavi regime, which created a fertile ground for similar reasons that I described above for the rise and emergence of Islamic fundamentalism in Iran. These authoritarian policies undermined the forces of democratic secularism and liberalism, and inadvertently strengthened the forces of political Islam in the lead up to the 1979 revolution. In short, in the same way that the forces of political Islam emerged from decades of authoritarianism as the only credible and organized opposition in Iran, a similar, though not identical, situation prevails in much of the Arab world today. To decry this state of affairs is to ignore the political consequences of supporting repressive authoritarian regimes. Ultimately, one cannot support the social conditions that give rise to Islamic fundamentalism, and then expect secular Norwegian or Swedish liberal democrats to emerge after the revolution. Given this enveloping political context, the strength and popularity of religious movements makes perfect sociological and political sense, in part due to long-standing Western support for Middle Eastern dictatorships. In other words, the famous aphorism applies: you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Let me just get to a conclusion. To understand the tensions between Islam and democracy today in our world requires an understanding and an appreciation for history, specifically an appreciation for the long history and development of human rights and democracy here in the West, which was an evolutionary and gradual process. One of the key points of tension that I tried to highlight, and I think is important to keep in mind, is that all emerging democracies have to grapple with the place of religion in government. There are no blueprints to follow, no easy solutions that can be prescribed. Democratic bargaining and negotiation over the normative role of religion in politics is an inevitable part of the history and consolidation of democracy in all societies. No religion is born with an inherent predisposition toward democracy, liberalism, or secularism. Like other religious traditions that originated in the pre-modern era and are scripturally based, Islam, in my view, is neither more or less compatible with modernity than Christianity or Judaism. Not long ago, it was widely assumed, as I mentioned earlier, that Catholicism was an inherent and enduring obstacle to democracy, and that only Protestant majority countries would respect popular sovereignty. How many people would make that argument today? The key interpretive point that I think merits consideration is that all religious traditions are a highly complex body of ideas, beliefs, and doctrines that, when interpreted in a modern context, contain sufficient ambiguity and elasticity to be read in a variety of different ways. This is not to suggest that religious doctrine should be completely ignored when discussing democracy in the Middle East, but rather that the interpretation of religion is always contextual and evolving. And at best, it is only one factor among many that affects the prospects for democratization and liberalization. In the context of the contemporary Islamic world, the struggle for democracy has been negatively affected by ongoing intervention by outside powers, or from outside powers. Long-standing policies, particularly of the United States, in supporting authoritarian dictators, such as the Shah of Iran, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the House of Saud in Riyadh, have impeded the political development of the Middle East. Coupled with the destabilizing effects of the Israel-Palestine conflict, an environment has been created in the Middle East in the latter half of the 20th century that unfortunately has been more conducive to the growth of radical religious politics than of secular democratic politics. In this sense, the experience of the Middle East has been qualitatively different than the West's experience. External intervention by foreign powers in support of authoritarian regimes was not a factor in the long history and development of democracy in the West, while it has been a critical factor in the case of the modern Middle East. The political sociologist Asif Bayat has offered the following advice for those that are serious about engaging with and understanding the problems of political development in the Arab Islamic world today. And he has noted, quote, "Congruence between Islam and democracy is not simply a philosophical issue, as it is widely assumed in the West, but rather it is a political one. It is a matter of struggle. It is a matter of human struggle. The pertinent question is not whether Islam and democracy are compatible, least of all because of the contested meanings attached to both Islam and democracy, but rather the real question, he suggests, is how and under what social conditions can Muslims make their religion compatible with desired notions of democracy? How, in other words, can they legitimize and popularize an inclusive reading of their religious doctrine and heritage in the same way that Democrats in the West historically have struggled to broaden what was once an understanding of democracy that was very narrow, that was very white, that was very male-centered, and that really applied only to the propertied classes in the West. Professor Bayat suggests that future debate on the topic of Islam and democracy should be less abstract, less ideological, and more rooted in actual case studies and in solid empirical analysis of the social conditions that can actually promote democracy in societies where religion is a marker of identity. Yes, religious doctrine and theology are important, but equally important are the domestic, regional, and international economic and political contexts that shape the contours of religious interpretation, social debate, and political struggle in the Muslim world today. And I think to ignore these obvious factors and these obvious contexts is to do so at our own analytic peril. Thanks for your attention.